Hi, this is Justin Colletti. You may know me from Sonic Scoop, but today I'm on the Plugin Lines channel, and we're going to be doing a little bit of a mini masterclass in loudness for mastering and for mixing. We're going to answer one of the most commonly asked questions around level and loudness, which is, how loud should my masters be? How loud should I mix? And do I really have to shoot for the targets that Spotify and Apple Music and the other streaming services give me? The short answer to that last question is no, probably not. Or at least practically none of your favorite records end up at those recommended loudness levels, which are overly conservative for modern music production in the opinions of many producers and engineers. There are some exceptions of this, of course, and we're going to go super deep with some audio examples you get to hear along with me. And we'll also talk about how to get your tracks appropriately loud without making them sound worse, and ideally, while making them sound even better. So you can get a feel for how these different loudness targets sound compared to one another. Let's listen to some unmastered and mastered tracks that I've done for a variety of clients in a variety of genres.
I give it all now. The moment is right now. I have to stop daydreaming. Nowhere to hide, nothing inside me. Nowhere to hide, nothing inside me. Nowhere to hide, nothing inside me. I can't wait to bother you. I can't wait to bother you. So, girl, pick yourself and find hope hides in dark where you can see the light. You got the information, you got the dedication to make it out alive.
In each of the before and after mastering examples you'll hear from me, I use nothing but plugins in the Plugin Alliance family of tools, and I think we got some pretty great results out of these tracks. But in addition to limiters like the BX Limiter, the BX Limiter True Peak, and the XLV2, some of the more useful tools in here are some utilities like SPL's HawkEye, Adapter Audio's Streamliner, and Adapter Audio's Metric AB, all of which can play an extremely useful role in measuring and making decisions about loudness and levels in both mixing and mastering. All right, before we get into some of these audio examples, I just want to give you a broad conceptual framework so you can think through how loud to go for yourself. And I'll also start off by giving you some concrete recommendations for the loudness targets you probably should be shooting for, depending on what genre you're working in. As mentioned, streaming services like Spotify, like Apple Music, and like YouTube will have pretty conservative guidelines for how loud you should go with your masters. A common target you'll hear thrown around is negative 14 LUFS, or LUFS. This means loudness units full scale. When it comes to loudness units, the bigger the number, the more dynamic the material is. So 14 loudness units, that basically means that the gap between the highest peaks and the average level of the track is about 14 dB. That's pretty dynamic for modern popular music. On the far end of the spectrum, something like 5 loudness units means there's only a 5 dB difference between the loudest peaks and the average level of your tracks. It's rare for even the loudest tracks out there to get much louder than 5 LUFS, but every once in a while it may happen, and there are some genres that absolutely cannot and don't want to be pushed that hard. The difference between LU, loudness units, and LUFS, loudness units full scale, is just that loudness units full scale is a negative number, which shows you loudness units as it relates to digital 0, which is the highest you can go on the meter. So most of the loudness ratings you'll see will be measured in LUFS or LUFS. In my experience, if you master your records to have a reading of negative 14 LUFS, chances are that they're going to sound relatively quiet compared to other major commercial releases when they're put up on playlists on streaming services. The streaming services do try to do some automatic volume normalization where they take the loudest tracks and just turn them down a little bit. But this is not perfect. While it makes the loudness wars and the quest for loudness at all costs less of an issue than in the past, it doesn't make it go away completely. Fortunately, this automatic volume normalization that the streaming services do make it so that there aren't huge jumps from track to track. So you don't have to try to squeeze out every last little dB of loudness you can in hopes of beating the competition in loudness, but you still want to get into the same ballpark. So what is the ballpark? Well, it really depends on genre. And as a general rule, the more processed and programmed and electronic the genre, the harder you can push things and the louder your tracks can go before you start sacrificing quality. Whereas the more organic and performed your tracks are and the more live instruments are in them, the less hard you can tend to push things before you start to hear the artifacts of compression and limiting. So those genres where there's a lot of live performed instruments or a lot of acoustic instruments or any type of physical instrument that a human being is touching and manipulating with their hands, those genres tend to want to be a little bit quieter. Whereas those genres where you've got a lot of samples or electronic elements or programmed parts, you can often push those a little bit hotter. If you have an album that has both types of tracks on there, you might have to compromise a little bit, often holding back the more electronic tracks just a little bit so that they sit better together with the more acoustic or organic tracks on that record. So with that in mind, here is my personal list for the volume targets you should be shooting for depending on what genre you are in. When it comes to rock music or pop music with a lot of traditional physical instruments, I'm going to say a good target for you is going to be slightly louder than the streaming services recommend. A safe range for you is often going to be anywhere from -13 LUFS up to -10 LUFS, with -13 sounding pretty organic, pretty dynamic, pretty natural, and -10 starting to get into the territory where things are feeling a little bit more processed, a little bit more bombastic, but we're not pushing things so hard, so over the top that we're likely to really compromise on tone. If anything, if you can get away with it on a rock record, pushing it to -10 LUFS can often make it sound more impressive if we're talking about an integrated LUFS reading across the whole track. A lot of more modern styles of rock records and instrumental pop records can be in that -10 range and really feel and sound quite powerful and polished and pretty good. But you can potentially push things even harder than this safe range, particularly when we're talking about heavier rock genres and metal and kind of electronic pop crossovers. You can push beyond that -10 barrier. Just let it be known that the further you push, the more likely that you may have some trade-offs with extra saturation, extra distortion, making things sound a little bit less organic and natural and realistic, but potentially making things sound more aggressive, more bombastic, and more generally hyped up. Once you start to get into the territory of -9, -8, you're really starting to push it to as loud as you might want to go with most rock and pop records that have real physical instruments in them. But just because you can go to -10, or if you're really feeling frisky, as high as -8, doesn't mean that you should. If you want things to breathe a little bit more and feel a little bit more open and a little bit more inviting, sometimes going for quieter records, -13 LUFS, -12 LUFS, those kinds of records can sound good. They can be potentially less fatiguing and more welcoming. And some people just prefer music that sounds less compressed, less overprocessed. Although the automatic volume normalization that these streaming services do isn't perfect, they definitely help bridge the gap between quieter masters and louder masters without eliminating that gap completely. There are, however, genres where you can go a little bit louder. Hip-hop records, for example, tend to be mastered a little bit louder than rock and organic pop records. With hip-hop, you could still go as quiet as -13 LUFS, and there are some hip-hop records out there, particularly old school ones and even some modern ones that are mastered relatively quietly. But I would say that in general, a lot of hip-hop records are going to push much more in that -10 to -8 range. And you have a safe range here with hip-hop of as low as -13, more all the way up to -8. And of course, maybe, you can push it a little bit hotter than that. One of the big problems, though, with trying to get hip-hop records to be even louder than this is there's often a trade-off between loudness and low end. And hip-hop records often like to have a lot of low end crammed into them. And if you want to start to get your hip-hop records much louder than -8, you can sometimes start having these trade-offs where you can get more distortion, more saturation in a way that makes things sound smaller rather than bigger. Or you're going to have to start compromising on how much low end you load into the record, which is the last thing that a lot of hip hop producers and mixers want to do. With EDM, however, and electronic records, where you don't need quite the bottom end that you often have in hip hop, you can go louder than this still. I would say it would be really uncommon for EDM records to be any quieter than -8 LUFS. They kind of start where rock records leave off. So I would say that in general, in electronic genres, maybe somewhere from -10 to -7, maybe -6 is your safe range. There are some kind of chill and ambient subgenres within electronic music that might go a little quieter than that. But I think most of the time, you're going to hear a lot of records in that -8 to -6 LUFS range. And some of the biggest EDM records out there can get even hotter than that, sometimes touching the -5 and maybe even louder into the -4 level when it comes to loudness. But know that the louder you get, the harder it is to make things sound really great. It can be done, and I have heard, and I've even mastered records as hot as -5 and -4 that sound remarkably clean, remarkably impressive and full and smooth sounding for such a loud record, but it is more and more of a challenge. So these are just some broad overall ranges to shoot for. There literally aren't rules about this stuff, just guidelines, and there are some genres that are going to be on the quieter end. Classical music, for instance, can be way more dynamic than -14 LUFS. And some rock and metal and pop and electronic records are mastered even louder than we've just discussed here. Now, remember, all of these numbers that I just threw out at you are for mastered tracks. You don't necessarily need to mix as loud as we're talking about. In fact, shooting for mixing levels that are quieter than this, probably a good approach. Particularly if you're on the newer end when it comes to mixing, I would recommend shooting for your mixes to be -14 or quieter. Anywhere from an average level of -22 to -14 is a pretty good level to mix at, especially if you don't want to load up your master fader with a whole bunch of bus compression and limiting. If you feel like you're not really comfortable and confident using compressors and limiters yet, shooting for those more conservative targets, -22, -18, those can be great places to go when you're mixing. And then use the help of a mastering engineer or do a separate dedicated mastering session where you're trying to get the level of the track up overall to some of these mastering targets that we're talking about. All right, let's take a quick listen to a track that I've been mastering for an artist called Londinium. This is from an upcoming album of theirs. One of the band members, a guy named Varun, mixed this, did a really great job of it. And this is one of those cases where getting levels and loudness right in mastering isn't always about adding a ton of level. In fact, if you look at the loudness of the unmastered and the mastered track on Adapter Audio's Streamliner, you can see that they're practically the same level in the loudest sections of the song. The unmastered one's clocking in at -10.9 LUFS and the mastered version just a smidge louder at -10.5. But to me, the mastered version sounds significantly louder and more massive just because of things like EQ choices. Let's have a listen to the before and after. Here's the unmastered version and then the mastered.
Nowhere to hide, nothing inside me. Nowhere to hide, nothing inside me. Nowhere to hide, nothing inside me. Nowhere to hide, nothing inside me.
And you can see and hear in this dense chorus section, the difference between the two is like 0.3 dB at times, but we really do get a sense of it feeling louder in the mastered version because loudness, perceived loudness, is not only about just how hard we're hitting things with the limiter, but also our EQ choices. And generally speaking, to our ears, brighter sounds louder. And in addition to brightness, sometimes amping up both the lows and the highs gives us the perception of more loudness, which is what's going on here. And this happens for two reasons. Brighter generally sounds louder to us because our ears are more sensitive to upper mid-range frequencies and high frequencies than they are to lower mid-range and low frequency sounds. And they just take up a little bit less energy, and you get to keep more headroom in the mix if the mix starts to skew a little bit brighter and a little bit leaner and tighter in the low mids and in the low end. But also if you're boosting both the lows and the highs and you get a little bit of a scoop going in the low mids, this can give things the impression of being louder as well for more psychoacoustic reasons. You may have heard of the Fletcher-Munson curve, and this is a chart that shows how sensitive our ears are at different frequencies. And generally speaking, the louder we play back music, the more we start to perceive low frequencies and high frequencies. And sometimes having amped up lows and highs gives us this psychoacoustic impression of, oh, this must be loud because there's amped up lows and highs. So playing a little bit with either of these quirks of human hearing, either by adding a bit more brightness or by adding a little bit more brightness complemented with a little bit more sub, we can get more perceived loudness at the same levels on the LUFS meter. LUFS meters and loudness units try to compensate for these quirks of human hearing a little bit, but they don't do it perfectly. So it's still a cheat, a hack you can do in the system. So remember, EQ is a portion of loudness, not just limiting and what you see in the loudness meters. Another benefit of applying a little bit more limiting and compression like I've done on this track is that's actually going to make the quieter sections sound a little bit louder as well. So even when we level match the loudest sections, the choruses on this song, when we go and play the verses, you'll see and hear that those quieter sections are significantly louder on the mastered version. Let's reset these meters and take a closer look at the verse.
I need a break now. I need lady luck now. I've got a heavy burden. I give it all now. The moment is right now. I have to stop daydreaming. Nowhere to hide, nothing inside me. Nowhere to hide, nothing inside me. Nowhere to hide, nothing inside me.
And there, if you were paying attention during this quieter section, the difference between the two tracks was more like 2 or 3 dB. So even though we were practically level matching the loudest sections, those quieter sections were brought up significantly by adding a little bit more limiting overall to the track. And that is one of the potential benefits for shooting louder than some of the targets that the streaming services give you. You'll notice that once the heavy section kicked in once again, the differences in the level on the LUF meter started to come more and more close together. So this is another thing to be aware of when it comes to loudness. We could look at loudness at just a moment in time, or over a short period, or over the length of the entire track, the last of which is called integrated loudness, which is the kind of loudness reading that places like Spotify and Apple Music use for their automatic volume normalization functions. Even more sophisticated loudness meters, like the ones you'll find in SPL HawkEye from Plugin Alliance, let you take a look at all three of these: the momentary, really quick loudness, the short-term loudness, and the integrated or full-length loudness over an entire track. We can go into a little bit more theory later on, but for right now, let's hear some more tracks. For this next example, we will see and hear a more radical change in loudness. We'll once again do a rock track, and then we'll hear some more electronic tracks in just a minute. But for this one, it's a song called Hymn of Him by an artist called Ray, that's spelled R-A-E, produced and mixed by a guy named Aaron Cafaro. Really good job on this one. It's got a female singer, and this mix started off a little bit quieter, and I brought it up considerably, and based on some of the references that these folks were listening to, I decided to go even louder with this master. I have one version here that is substantially louder on this track, and then an even louder version of the master down here. And as I take it even louder, I go even brighter with it. Because the reality is, when you want to load a lot of loudness into a track, you've generally got to compromise with just how much low end and low mid-range you can put into the record. So here it is, first the unmastered track up top. So pretty huge difference in loudness on that one, right? We're starting off with a track that is mixed around -16 LUFS in the loudness section, which is a good level to be mixing at. Anywhere from -22 to -14 is a totally fine target for shooting for in the mix. But you can see these mastered versions are a whole lot louder, -5.6 and -4.6 LUFS in the loudest section of the song. Once we take the whole song into account, the overall integrated LUFS reading for this track is likely to be a little bit quieter. There are some substantially less loud sections near the beginning of this song, and that's going to take the integrated loudness value down a little bit, the one that services like Spotify and Apple Music actually use for their automatic volume normalization. But I'll say that even though we're pushing this section pretty darn loud, -5, -4 LUFS, this is past the upper ends that I was recommending for rock music, we still have a record that sounds pretty good and honestly, to my ears, sounds better than the original mix, even when it's level matched. Here, let's do an experiment. These are about 10 dB apart, maybe 11 dB apart in level. Let's go ahead and just equalize the volume between all these tracks and hear them where they're pretty much level matched. And you tell me if you believe we're compromising the tone by adding this amount of loudness. Here, I'll take the unmastered track and boost it up by about 5.5 dB. And I'll take the mastered versions and take these down by about 5.5 dB. And there you go. Even though we've added substantial loudness to the mastered versions, to me, they sound more like records in this genre are supposed to sound once we've mastered it. The snare drum, the rest of the drum kit tightens up a little bit more. The guitars kind of start to leap forward a little bit more. Things are getting tighter and more massive and powerful at the same time. And even when they're level matched, the mastered versions sound louder and bigger to me. So it's not just about the LUFS reading. It's also about EQ and other forms of dynamic control that really make the track come to life and seem louder at the same level. Here, let's check out a couple more examples, this time in more of an electronic style. I'll do one that's a bit more of a subtle change in level and one that's more of an extreme change in level once again. I have a track here called Bother from an artist called Twin Lights. All right, let's hear this one before and after. And here you can see there's about 2.5 dB of level being added in the loudest section here. But the difference in the quieter sections is going to be even more significant. Let's take a spin back to an earlier section in this track.
Running from something I don't have the answers to. If I say it's nothing, I'm still getting over you. The drinks keep on coming and I don't know what to do. I'm lost in the thought of a love that I ran from.
So in this section of the track, it's more like 3 to 4 dB at times of level being added. So this is one of the important things to realize about shooting for a little bit louder than the streaming services recommend. Even if we were to take this louder track and turn it down by a couple dB to match the quieter unmastered versions of the track, the quieter sections of the louder master are still going to sound louder than the quieter sections of the unmastered track. Here's a quick example. I'm going to turn down this mastered version by about 2 dB. This way they'll be basically level matched in the loudest section of the track. But when we listen to the quieter bits, you'll hear that this mastered version is definitely louder, even though we're level matched in the loudest sections and in the track overall. Here's the before.
Running from something I don't have the answers to. say it's nothing, I'm still getting over you. The drinks keep on coming and I don't know what to do. I'm lost in the thought of a love that I ran from to.
So even though I've brought down this mastered version by a couple dB, it's still substantially louder, especially in these quiet sections. But when we play back this louder section, you'll see that they're basically level matched.
I can't wait to bother you. I've been trying. I can't wait to bother you.
So there you have it. Once again, even though we have level matched the loudest sections on these two tracks, the quieter sections are substantially louder on this mastered version. And because of the EQ settings and the actual other things going on in the mastering, the loudest section sounds louder in the mastered version, even when they're level matched. Because again, perceived loudness is not only about what you see on the LUFS meter, it's also about the EQ curve and other factors in the master that can give you more perceived loudness at the same reading on the meters. This final track is called Rise Up. It's by an artist named Karen Bella, produced by a great artist in his own right, a guy named Josh Dion. They did a great job on this one, and in the master, I think it gets taken even further. The original mix is a little bit more mid-rangey than other tracks in this style, and the final master, once again, gets a little bit brighter, a little bit clearer, a little bit more amped up and hyped up, and there's a little bit more depth, dimension, and detail, and there's also significantly more loudness. And although the master version gets pretty high up there in loudness, again, I don't think that we're detracting from the sound quality. I think we're adding to it in the master. You listen for yourself and be the judge. Here's the before.
Thought about it twice to take my life. Ultimate sacrifice to turn the lights off. Rise up, not gonna give up. Everything is in front of you, who knows what will happen to you. There is a life within the cage, so you don't make a permanent mistake. Don't cry, little girl, pick yourself and fight. Hope hides in dark where you can see the light. You got the information, you got the dedication to make it out alive.
And there you can hear we're adding 4 or 5 dB of loudness, and it also sounds better. And I think that when we take down the volume on this mastered version, it will still sound louder once we decrease it by about 5 dB. Here we go. Let's listen to the same before and after now.
Thought about it twice to take my life. Ultimate sacrifice to turn the lights off. Rise up, not gonna give up. Everything is in front of you, who knows what will happen to you. There is a life within the cage, so you don't make a permanent mistake. Don't cry, little girl, pick yourself and fight. Hope hides in dark where you can see the light. You got the information, you got the dedication to make it out alive. And I don't know if I wanna change my whole view about it. And I don't know if I can look another way. What all my friends say about it? They're impressed, my brothers, sisters don't wanna hear what they say.
So there, I think you get the idea. Once again, adding level and going beyond the levels that these streaming services recommend don't necessarily make your track sound worse. And if you do things right, properly EQing things, properly clipping and saturating and maybe widening things or focusing things, you can get masters that sound better than your mixes, even when they're substantially louder. And sometimes in part because they're substantially louder. For a lot of modern music genres, the sound of limiting and compression is just part of the sound of those records. And perhaps just as importantly, the kinds of things that you have to do with EQ and other tools to make it possible to get this loud and get this loud in a clean way are also part of the sound of modern records. All right, we've looked a lot at loudness units, but one other thing that we should talk about here is peak levels. In general, most mastering engineers don't set their final output level to 0 dBFS all the way up. A lot of mastering engineers set it a bit lower, maybe negative 0.4 or negative 0.8. Spotify, for example, encourages you to do negative 1 for your output level instead of 0. And if you're mastering louder than their recommended targets, they recommend that you do an output level of negative 2. So why is this recommended? It's because of something called inter-sample peaks. And inter-sample peaks are a little funny thing that can happen in digital audio. You can have a digital audio waveform that's sampled in 2 places, and neither of those places go above digital 0. However, because of the trajectory implied between those 2 sample points, you can infer that a spot in between those 2 sample points could be louder than 0. That's an inter-sample peak, and a conventional limiter can't do anything about inter-sample peaks. While you can get away with a little bit in the way of inter-sample peaks without an issue, if you have excessive and excessively loud inter-sample peaks, it can cause distortion. And the hotter your tracks get, the closer you're pushing them to those little LUFS numbers, the higher the likelihood that you could have a whole bunch of these little inter-sample peaks that can create some additional distortion that can be a problem once your tracks go through the codecs for these streaming services. The old school approach to dealing with this was just to turn down the output of your end limiter in the mastering chain. Again, anywhere from negative 0.4 to negative 0.8, pretty common, although Spotify and others recommend even lower than that. But another way to handle this is with a true peak limiter. A true peak limiter like the BX Limiter True Peak, or the one built into the BX MasterDesk Pro, captures those intersample peaks by doing some oversampling under the hood. This way, you don't necessarily have to bring down your output dim below 0 at all, although probably out of superstition and habit, I still tend to bring mine down to negative 0.1, just a tiny little bit. But the idea with this type of true peak limiter is that it makes it so you can have your final output even louder without having to worry about that kind of intersample clipping caused by intersample peaks. These intersample peaks or true peaks, you can also look at them on metering plugins like Adapter Audio Streamliner, which will really quickly and easily show you both the LUFS level of your tracks and your true peak levels. If you want to go into even more detail with your meters, the SPL HawkEye from Plugin Alliance is awesome. It gives you a spectrogram and the ability to see both long-term and short-term loudness on your LUFS meters. There's also a correlation meter here. But my personal favorite way to measure loudness isn't with meters at all. It's with my ears. And that's where referencing is super important. When I try to figure out the right level for my clients' tracks to be, the thing that I want to do is get some of their favorite sounding records into my ear. Get a sense for how loud they like things, how bright they like things, how bottom heavy they like things to be, how compressed and limited their favorite records sound. And if I can pull up a whole bunch of references in their general genre or style, the kinds of records that they want to be on a playlist with, the kinds of records that you know that they're going to bring up in their car to do the car check and say, does my record stand up to these records? Those are the records I want to hear. And by ear, I try to get into the same ballpark level of loudness. Because although LUFS and loudness units do try to compensate for the differences in brightness and frequency distribution, I still find that my ear just does it better than any meter that I've seen. And only when there's a question with the artist of just how loud we should go, will I start double checking the meters and we'll start having a conversation around numbers saying, oh, should we go a half dB quieter or a half dB louder? But I really want to get into the right ballpark just using the ear, because that helps me make decisions that aren't only about the numbers I'm seeing on the meters, but make decisions about how limited or compressed things should sound or shouldn't sound, how bright or dark or fat or tight things should sound, because each and every one of those variables has an impact on perceived loudness. But one little caveat I will add is that sometimes you want to compare your tracks to others with their loudness level matched. Because you don't want to get into this place where you're just trying to chase loudness and see if you sound as good as other tracks by applying more limiting and more compression, when you really want to get a fair apples to apples comparison so that you're not led too much astray by differences in volume and you don't reach immediately for that loudness dial on the limiter to solve every problem you have in your mixes or in your master. By level matching at least some of the time against references, or even against other tracks on an album you're mastering, you can get a clearer picture for just how things compare once you take the misleading elements of loudness out of the equation. There's no better plugin I know of for doing just that than Adapter Audio's Metric AB. Your most powerful tools when it comes to getting things sounding louder are obviously limiters. Limiters, even more so than compressors, are going to help you bring up the levels of your track by taking the loudest sounds and just turning them down so you can take the quietest sounds and bring them up. The problem with too much limiting is you get potentially some clipping, some distortion, things sound less natural and organic, but the benefit of limiting is that in some genres, it's just part of the way records sound and can kind of sound good and not sound professional when you don't use any. Something like the Brainworx BX limiter True Peak is a great limiter to have at the very end of your chain. But even simpler limiters, like the original BX limiter, can be great to use, not only as a slightly different sounding limiter that you could use on your master bus, but also on individual subgroups and on individual instruments. When you want to get masters that sound really loud and really good, usually not all of your limiting is just coming from the master limiter at the very end of your chain. There's often going to be little bits of dynamic control that happen along the way. The greatest loud-sounding masters come from the greatest loud-sounding mixes, and using little bits of limiting on buses or individual instrument tracks can definitely be part of having a really good-sounding loud mix, and therefore getting you a really good-sounding loud master. But limiters are not your only tools when it comes to loudness. Things like compressors and multiband compressors and saturators and dynamic EQs and de-essers, all of these frequency-dependent dynamic range control tools and saturators and clippers can play a role in helping things get louder while still sounding good. But in addition to them, the other most powerful tool you have when it comes to making things louder is your EQ. As a general rule, brighter sounds louder. And although LUFS meters try to compensate for this, it's just the way that we hear. We're more sensitive, particularly to upper mid-range frequencies, than we are to lower frequencies. And in addition, low frequencies eat up headroom in your mix a lot faster than do mid-range and upper frequencies. Low frequencies just require a lot more energy to be heard. So if you want to get even hotter on the LUFS meter while using less limiting and less compression to get there, having a brighter mix will help you go in that direction. But of course, if you make your mix too bright, it's going to sound edgy and harsh and annoying and just not pleasant to listen to. One of the nasty byproducts that we can get when we start to apply a bit more limiting is that tracks can start to sound a bit more mid-rangey, a little bit more closed in, and they can start to lose clarity and detail when that's exactly what we want to add more of to the track in mastering. In fact, the more limiting that you do to a track, the more that you're often going to have to compensate with some additional EQ to make up for some of the unwanted byproducts of excessive limiting and compression. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that little mini masterclass in loudness and LUFS for mastering, for mixing, for streaming services. Don't be afraid to push things to the levels that they need to get to sound right for your style and to live well on playlists next to some of your other favorite records. But also know that the automatic volume normalization that streaming services are doing are leveling the playing field a little bit. They're making it so that you don't have to bend over backwards and make things sound worse trying to squeeze every last little dB or half dB out of your tracks just to try to win on loudness. So to help keep you from trying to win battles with loudness, I really recommend you use tools like Adapter Audio's Streamliner, or even better yet, Adapter Audio's Metric AB. They allow you to monitor loudness. You can hear your tracks through the streaming codecs with Adapter Audio Streamliner, or you can compare your tracks to reference tracks in a really precisely level-matched way, better than any other that I know about with Metric AB. So let me know in the comments down below, what are some of your favorite tools to use to get things sounding loud while still sounding good? And are there specific targets that you shoot for in your final mixes or your final masters? I want to hear from you about your best practices and what you thought about the before and afters in this video. As always, if you want to try out any of the tools you saw in this video, all of these plugins can be demoed for free for 2 weeks over at plugin-alliance.com. Or if you're a subscriber to the Mega Subscription Bundle, one of the biggest steals in pro audio, in my humble opinion, then these are just some plugins that are part of your toolkit already, just included in that subscription. Thanks again for hanging out with me, Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, this time on the Plugin Alliance channel. See you next time.